Good afternoon. How is everybody doing today? Excellent. Okay, that's it. That's all I need to do then. I'm just here. We can all bask in my glory, I guess. Today we are diving into a topic in American history, one that is perhaps familiar to you, but we'll go at it in a maybe a different perspective, looking at different aspects of the 1920s. The Roaring 20s, as I've called it here. Why was it called the Roaring 20s? Any ideas? Stock market was up. That was certainly part of the roaring of it. The post-war era. Which war? Which war? Yeah, that was a misnomer, wasn't it? The First World War, the supposed war to end all wars, which just sparked other wars, but that's, again, an entirely different story. We're going to be looking at the 1920s because it was a period of profound change in American society. We can think of World War I as essentially the end of the long 19th century. And when we come out of World War I, we are smack into the 20th century. And a lot of the events, the changes, the ideas that will shape 20th century America really come to fruition here in the 1920s. We begin to see the formation of modern American society during this decade. So let's dive into the Roaring 20s and talk about society and culture in the Jazz Age. It's another nickname for the decade, right? The Jazz Age. Why? A lot of jazz. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Now, before we dive into the 1920s themselves, there are a couple of things we have to think about. One, the First World War. The First World War, which the United States is involved in from 1917 to 1918. We get into that fight late, was to that point in history the costliest, the most destructive war in human history. It was a war that toppled empires. The German Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire are all dismantled as a result of the First World War. So it was a huge catastrophe in many ways. And it does have an impact on the United States and on American society. Because when 1917 comes along, in April 1917, the United States declares war on Germany. And we start to get men in uniform going off to fight in Europe. They are leaving behind their families. They are leaving behind their jobs. And who emerges to fill a lot of those jobs that are left empty? Women. Women go into the factories. Women take over the jobs of being ambulance drivers and mail carriers and all that sort of stuff here in the United States. And that will have a profound impact on American society and on the role that women play in broader American society. And we'll get into that in a minute. But one of the most immediate outcomes of women having a more pronounced role in society was that the women's suffrage movement, the struggle to get women the right to vote, is energized or re-energized. And it does gain a substantial national backing. So that is an important event leading us into the 1920s. There's also another social reform movement that gains traction during the First World War, and that was the temperance movement. Now, what was the temperance movement all about? Getting rid of alcohol. Now, why were the temperance crusaders such drags? Well, they thought that alcohol was the root of all evil in society. Why were you poor? Well, it was because you drank. Why did you kill your wife? Well, it was because you drank. That sort of stuff. Those are kind of extreme examples, but they viewed alcohol as the root of all evil. The temperance movement had really been growing in the United States over the second part of the 19th century. It was not a majority of the American public, certainly, that supported temperance, but what we see during the First World War is that there was a reduction in available alcohol for consumption in this country, because alcohol and the production of alcohol was considered a war necessity. So you see restrictions on the use of alcohol domestically in the United States. And that also has a profound impact in the post-war period, because it will lead, well, both of those things, the temperance movement and the women's suffrage movement will lead to the ratification of two separate amendments to the Constitution. And this is how we start off the 1920s. Those two amendments were the 18th and the 19th Amendments. The 18th Amendment, here's the text of most of it. After 1 year from the ratification of this article, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within, the importation thereof into, or the exportation thereof from the United States and all territories subject to the jurisdiction thereof, for beverage purposes is hereby prohibited. What does the 18th Amendment do? Well, we get there, but it is the constitutional amendment that institutes prohibition in the United States. Now, prohibition does not begin in January of 1919. That's when the amendment is ratified, but it's 1 year after that. So it's January of 1920 when prohibition goes into effect in the United States. That, of course, has a profound impact on American society in a whole bunch of ways, and we'll talk about that. In 1920, the 19th Amendment is ratified. And what does the 19th Amendment do? Well, this one's a much shorter one, pretty easy to understand. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. What does that lead us to? Congratulations. Women finally get the right to vote all across the United States. Now, the suffrage movement had been a century-long struggle, essentially. And there were parts of the United States, particularly out west in places like Montana and Wyoming and Idaho, where there weren't a lot of people living, where women did have the right to vote in national elections. But in places like New York and the Carolinas and along the East Coast, women were restricted in what elections they could vote for. Some could vote in municipal elections, most could vote in school board elections, but there were a lot of women who were not allowed to vote for national elections, presidential elections, or congressional elections, until 1920 with the ratification of this amendment. Now, both of these, of course, have a profound impact on American society over the course of the decade. And we'll start by looking at what is one of the immediate effects of the 19th Amendment. Well, 1920 is a presidential election year. So women now have the right to vote. And what do they do in November of 1920? They go out and vote. Now, what was the choice that the Americans had in the election of 1920? Who are we choosing between for president? The candidates you had were James Cox and his running mate for vice president, a young Franklin Roosevelt, and the Republican Warren G. Harding and his running mate, the former governor of Massachusetts, Calvin Coolidge. When the election occurs in November of 1920 and women go out in large numbers to cast their ballots for the presidency, this was the end result. Here it is Harding in blue and Cox in red. Who looks like they win that election? Well, Harding certainly wins much of the country, from New England all the way out to California. Cox, the Democrat, wins the South. Now, that is a legacy of the Civil War and Reconstruction, that solid South. Up until the 1960s, the southern states, the former Confederacy, could almost be counted upon to vote for Democratic candidates. Didn't matter who that Democratic candidate was. They generally won the South. That changes in the 1960s. So as a result of this, Harding gets 76% of the electoral vote and is elected president of the United States, taking office in 1921. Now, Harding was an interesting guy. He was an Ohio businessman who had lots of friends, poker buddies, drinking buddies. Now consider, he is elected president of the United States at a time when prohibition was in effect. Is Harding, president of the United States, whose job is to uphold the laws of the United States, going to be a strong supporter of prohibition? Well, publicly he is, But privately at the White House, he had a fully stocked wine cellar with lots of liquors and whiskeys and that sort of stuff, so that when his poker buddies came over, they could play poker and smoke cigars and have a nice drink. But that's a different side of the story. Harding is elected president, does take office in 1921. He had campaigned on a promise of a return to normalcy. Now, what does that mean? A return to normalcy. Well, normalcy was a word he made up, or his campaign made up, but what he was saying is that he wanted to go back, the government to go back to how it had been prior to the First World War. He does use that, he uses America first, actually, as one of his campaign slogans. But the idea of the return to normalcy was that during the war effort, Woodrow Wilson's administration and the federal government had grown tremendously large. Lots of new offices sprang up, lots of new laws were put into place to kind of curtail the civil rights of Americans. And Harding said, we're going to get rid of all of that. We want to reduce the size of the federal government. We want to streamline the budget. We want to kind of go back to how things were before this growth of bureaucracy and federal offices. So he promises a return to normalcy. He is elected overwhelmingly in 1920. And when he comes into office, he does undertake an attempt to streamline the budget, to make the federal budget less ponderous, which is a major undertaking. He offered farm assistance. Now, why was that necessary? Well, because during the First World War, farmers were reaping a financial benefit because American farmers were not only feeding the American public, but the American military and our allies overseas. So there was a high demand for American farm products. When that demand disappeared, what happens to farm prices? They're going to collapse. So there needed to be some mechanism in place to prevent farmers from losing everything. So there was farm assistance. And somewhat surprisingly, Harding does push for the passage of anti-lynching laws. Lynching was a particular problem across the South and the Midwest. It was a extra-legal, often racial-based form of killing. And Harding, as President of the United States, did push to reform that. Now, Harding's presidency, he was popular as president. People liked him. They thought he was a good-looking guy, whatever your taste is. He did have a lot of public backing. But what was going on behind the scenes of Harding's presidency? All sorts of corruption. Now, Harding himself was not directly involved in the corruption. It was the people that he trusted, the people that he appointed to office, those drinking and poker buddies, took advantage of Harding as president of the United States. There is a story of Harding when he was growing up. Supposedly, his father once said to him, "Warren, it's good that you weren't born a girl because you can't say no to anybody." And that kind of idea certainly stuck to Harding during his presidency. He was taken advantage of by the people he put in office, by the people he put in his cabinet, by his close friends. He couldn't say no to his friends. So what we see during his presidency are numerous scandals. There was a scandal in the Justice Department. The Attorney General of the United States is actually accused of corruption during that time. He's acquitted of those charges. There is a scandal at the Veterans Bureau. The Veterans Bureau was established in the aftermath of the First World War to build veterans hospitals for the soldiers that had been wounded during the war. The director of the Veterans Bureau and the people that were responsible for building the veterans hospitals managed to find a way to fleece the American public. Basically, the contractor would charge, let's say, $400 per bed in this hospital, when it cost them $200 per bed. Well, where was that extra $200 going? It was going into pockets. It was lining the pockets of all the people involved in that scandal. And there was perhaps the most significant presidential scandal to that time, the Teapot Dome scandal. Now, what was the Teapot Dome scandal all about? Anybody heard of Teapot Dome? Can't remember what it is. It was about a breakfast beverage, right? No. Teapot Dome involved oil. At a place called Teapot Dome in Wyoming, there was a national oil reserve that had been set aside for the Navy, for the use of naval warships and other federal federal projects. And this was under the control of the Department of the Navy. Here we see an oil gusher right there. Well, when Harding comes to office, when he becomes president, the person he appoints to be the Secretary of the Interior, that man over there, Albert Fall, convinces the Secretary of the Navy to put that land, those naval reserves, under the control of the Interior Department. Then, what does Fall do? He begins to offer no-bid leases to private oil companies to exploit the resources there at Teapot Dome and another oil field in California. Now, there was nothing illegal about that to this point. As Secretary of the Interior, Fall had the power to do that, to offer those no-bid leases to these oil companies. The problem is that Fall, who was a man of limited economic means, suddenly shows up flush with cash. He is buying 8,000-acre ranches out in the West. He is living well beyond his means in Washington, D.C. He is spending money all over the place, and people say, that doesn't seem right. He can't do that on his federal salary, and we know he doesn't have a lot of money. So questions are asked, and what becomes apparent as those questions are asked? Well, where was he getting his money? The oil companies. They were paying him off. They were bribing him. They were giving him gifts to have access to these federal oil reserves. Now, all of this is happening without Harding's awareness. Harding has no idea that his Secretary of the Interior is doing this. When news does reach Harding in 1923, he is irate. There's a story that he calls Fall to the White House, and when the Secretary of the Interior enters, Harding grabs him by the lapels and is shaking him violently, almost to the point of knocking him unconscious. Eventually, Harding does manage to gain control of himself. He essentially fires Fall, and then Harding has to get out of Washington. He is so upset by what is happening. He embarks on a cross-country train trip. And what happens on that cross-country train trip when he is out in California? He suffers a massive coronary and dies. So Harding dies in office. Now, what happens to Albert Fall? He has the somewhat ignoble distinction of being the first former cabinet member to ever be indicted and convicted and spend time in prison because of the bribery involved with the Teapot Dome scandal. Again, one of those great American presidential scandals that didn't directly involve the president. But Harding, angry, upset, goes across the country, has a heart attack. Now, there are rumors surrounding Harding's death. Some thought it was awfully suspicious that a man who looked outwardly healthy would die all of a sudden. Now, Harding may have appeared outwardly healthy, but he wasn't. And there were some who suspected that his wife may have poisoned him. Now, what would motivate a wife to poison her husband? Money, certainly, but that wasn't the issue here. Not another man, but another woman. Harding had several mistresses. And one of the rumors is that he actually died in the midst of laborious activity with one of his mistresses. And his wife some people blamed her for poisoning him because she knew about these affairs. Another stain on Harding's presidency. In any case, when Harding dies, who becomes president of the United States? But his vice president, Calvin Coolidge. There's Calvin Coolidge. What can we say about Calvin Coolidge? Silent Cal was one of his nicknames, Silent Cal. He was not the most talkative of presidents. We can long for those days again. And he was a man of very, very few words. There are lots of stories about Calvin Coolidge. One is that one day he went to church, one Sunday he went to church and heard the sermon, and when he came back from church, his wife asked him, what was the sermon about? And he said it was about sin. And his wife said, well, what did the minister say? And Calvin Coolidge said, well, he was against it. And that was the extent of their conversation. So he was a man of very, very few words. Now, when he becomes president as the successor to Harding, he becomes one of our least active presidents. He does not undertake any sort of legislative agenda. He wasn't going to put bills before Congress. He wasn't going to push Congress to do much. So he's just kind of keeping the seat warm in the White House. He, in general, avoided foreign policy initiatives. Not going to deal with diplomacy. I'm not dealing with domestic issues. I'm not going to deal with diplomacy. There's a story about him, another story, where somebody said, how did you know he wasn't dead while he was in office? Because he was so inactive and just kind of, didn't do much. Because of his inactivity, however, he was immensely popular. He didn't try to do anything, so he couldn't offend anybody, I guess. So his popularity was tremendously high, and he's easily reelected in 1924. So he gets his own term as president in 1924. Now, this is significant because when Harding dies in 1923, the United States economy is beginning to boom. There had been a slight economic downturn after the First World War, but by 1921, 1922, industry is picking up, farms are rebounding, the economy is growing tremendously, people had jobs, there was money in circulation, things looked good. Coolidge inherits that booming economy and easily wins re-election by not messing anything up, and will serve his own 4 years as president of the United States. Now, in the midst of all of this, presidential turnover and presidential scandals here in the United States, there was an international peace movement that begins to emerge. In the wake of the First World War and the destructiveness of the First World War, there was a hope in many parts of the world, in Europe and here in the United States, that perhaps humanity had learned its lesson from that conflict. Perhaps we had finally reached the point where we could move above our basic instincts and put war aside. So you see an international peace movement that emerges in the post-war years, tremendously idealistic and doomed to failure, but this was a popular sentiment among lots of people and lots of politicians and diplomats around the world. And as part of this post-war peace movement, there are many treaties that are signed, many agreements that are signed by various countries. One of the important events that occurs in the post-war peace movement were a series of naval disarmament conferences. The first one takes place in Washington, D.C. in 1922. The point of these naval disarmament conferences were that nations were going to limit the size of their navies. They were going to limit the number of ships they had, the size of their ships, the firing power of those ships. Now, why were we looking at navies in particular? Well, what was one of the causes of the First World War? A naval arms race between Great Britain and Germany. The Germans were building lots of ships. The British had to build more ships to maintain naval superiority. So if we could limit the size of global navies, of the navies of the great powers, that would limit the chance of the outbreak of another conflict. So in 1922, the Washington Naval Disarmament Conference is held. Another conference is later held in London, and a third one in Geneva, Switzerland, all with the aim of limiting the size of navies around the world. In 1928, another idealistic treaty, an idealistic agreement is signed. That is the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And what we see here is Coolidge signing the Kellogg-Briand Pact and kind of putting it into action. The Kellogg-Briand Pact was the creation of the American Secretary of State, William Kellogg, and the French Foreign Minister, Aristide Briand. Hence the name of the agreement. And what the Kellogg-Briand Pact was essentially an agreement by the countries that signed the document to not use war as an implement of statecraft. We see that in the opening paragraph over here. You might not be able to read it, so I'll read it to you. It says, the high contracting parties solemnly declare in the names of their respective peoples that they condemn recourse to war for the solution of international controversies and renounce it as an instrument of national policy in their relations with one another. What essentially does the Kellogg-Briand Pact do? That it outlaws war. It's a nice idea, right? There's a big problem with the Kellogg-Briand Pact, however. How do you enforce it? What happens if one of the countries that signs it, a country like Japan or Italy or Germany, decides to go to war? Yeah, the only way to stop it was by other countries to go to war. So it was an idealistic agreement. It was a symbol of that post-war peace movement, but it was, again, doomed to fail like the post-war peace movement itself. What's somewhat ironic is that technically the Kellogg-Briand Pact is still on the books. It has never been repudiated or renounced or taken off the books by any of the countries that signed it. Maybe Japan does, but by and large, it is still an implement of diplomacy that is still in effect. So the post-war peace movement certainly looms large in the story of the 1920s. But what's going on domestically? You know, we've looked at presidential politics. We have this kind of international peace movement. What's happening in the United States during the 1920s? Well, because people had jobs, because the economy was booming, it was a period, by and large, for many people in the United States, of affluence. People had money to buy stuff. Not everybody had that money, but certainly there was money in circulation. And it tended to be a period of frivolity. People were trying to have fun. Now, why would people be trying to have fun in the 1920s? Because it was after the war. People were trying to erase the memory of the turmoil, the struggle, the death and destruction of the First World War. Even if you had not served in France, had not been on the battlefields, your life was still tremendously impacted by the war. And there were hardships caused by it. So now that the war is over, we're going to put it behind us. We're going to have a good time. We're making money. We're going to spend the money we have. We want to live life today rather than thinking about tomorrow. So what we see were that people, by and large, tried to have a good time and tried to spend the money they had and even some money they didn't have. And that becomes problematic later on. But the 1920s, the Roaring 20s, were really a reaction to the First World War in a lot of ways. And it was a reaction to the First World War that was fueled by the economic boom that was occurring in the United States at that time. Now, one of the important cultural phenomenon, two of the important cultural phenomena that emerged during the 1920s that will shape American society and influence how Americans interact with one another were new forms of mass media. One was the cinema. Motion pictures. Now, motion pictures had been around for decades at this point, but really in the 1920s, they become a staple of American society. Most towns across the United States had at least one movie house in it. Major cities would have multiple movie houses. Some of them were tremendously elaborate palaces that kind of looked like old symphony halls or concert halls with the sculpture and the painted ceilings and stuff like that. Imagine going to the movies in a building like that today. So the movies become tremendously popular across the United States. They become one of the main forms of cultural entertainment over the course of the decade. And it is in the late 1920s that one movie in particular does upend cinema and usher us into a new time period in American film. That's this movie that we see advertised over here, The Jazz Singer. What was significant about The Jazz Singer? It was the first movie that had synchronized sound. To this point, most movies had been silent movies. We've all seen the silent movies, right? The Buster Keatons and the early Charlie Chaplins, where you had the signboards that came up to tell you what the dialogue was and what was going on in the story. What was revolutionary about The Jazz Singer was that it was a movie that had synchronized sound. Now, not throughout have any of you seen Al Jolson's Jazz Singer? It is a movie that's controversial today, because it basically depicts a white singer dressing in blackface to perform jazz songs in front of a segregated audience. So there's that big problematic aspect to it. Much of the movie is still a silent movie. But the singing scenes, the scenes in the theater, those have the synchronized sound, so you actually hear Al Jolson singing the songs that were being performed. And that was revolutionary. That was shocking. There were some studio executives in Hollywood who thought, this is ridiculous. Nobody wants to hear actors talk. So there were some who thought that this was a fad that was never going to catch on. Instead, what happens? It kind of squeezes out the silent pictures. It kills a lot of the careers of silent actors because they didn't have voices that were good for the talkies. They might have had the great face, but not the voice. So it does change cinema here in the United States and around the world. Hollywood starts to emerge as the film producing center of the United States during the 1920s. The other important mass media phenomenon of the decade was the radio. Radios start to become tremendously popular and affordable in the 1920s. And in fact, by 1929, about 40% of American households had a radio, which meant that if your family did not have one, you probably knew somebody who did. And radios really served as a means of drawing the nation together. Because what do we begin to see but nationwide radio broadcasts? There are, well, what do you get on the radio today? When you turn on the radio in your car, what are you listening to? Music, ads, yeah, sports, and news. Well, what were they covering? Were they broadcasting on the radio in the 1920s? Music, news, sports, and ads. And radio plays, which is, yeah, kind of, you can do that. You can still get those on your radio if you dial far enough to the left, I suppose. But the radio becomes a massively important medium of communication across the United States during the 1920s. It becomes hugely popular, a form of mass communication, a form of entertainment. People were listening to music. People were listening to news reports. It served to kind of draw the nation together. People in California could hear the same music and the same news that people in New York could hear. And that was revolutionary in all sorts of ways because it shortened distances, it brought more connections between East and West and North and South. Now, sports were particularly popular as radio broadcasts. People tuned in to hear the football game or the baseball game or the boxing match. And because of that, because of the growing popularity of sports in the 1920s, and because sports were carried across the country on the radio, and even in the cinema, video clips of athletes playing their games were often shown in the newsreels before the movies started, you do begin to see iconic figures in sports emerging. People who prior to the 1920s might have been celebrities in a local area start to gain a national reputation. And what we really start to see are some of the earliest sports superstars or sports heroes emerging in the United States during this time period. People who were known across the country. Here's a handful of them. You have Bobby Jones. And what was Bobby Jones best known for? Golf. He's one of the people that establishes the Masters down in Georgia. Red Grange, whose nickname was the Galloping Ghost. Football. If you can make out in that picture, this is the leather helmet days of football. A brutal, brutal game. You have Gertrude Ederle. Swimming. And what is she perhaps best known for? Swimming the English Channel. She becomes the first woman to swim across the English Channel. She was also an Olympic swimmer, so she participated in the Olympic Games. This guy named Babe Ruth, I don't know if he's familiar to anybody. Of course, Babe Ruth, the icon of baseball, and Jack Dempsey, heavyweight boxing champ. These people become hugely significant and tremendously famous because their exploits, what they were doing, were carried on radio, were heard across the country. Babe Ruth probably would have been an icon regardless, but because you could be in Southern California and be listening to the Yankees game, his reputation, his star really does shine tremendously bright. Mass media played an important role in creating the legends of these figures. The 1920s was also really the first time in American history where the automobile starts to shape society. The automobile, of course, is developed at first in Germany and as kind of a small four-wheeled vehicle, a personal locomotion vehicle. But by the time we get to the late 19th century, the early 20th century, there are innovations that are being made in internal combustion engines and attaching those internal combustion engines to four-wheeled vehicles. And we start to see various forms of early automobiles being established. In the United States, who becomes kind of the pioneer of automobile production? Henry Ford. What is it about Henry Ford that leads him to being the leader in industry in the United States? Mass assembly using the production line. Now, Henry Ford does not invent the production line, but he brings it to the automobile industry. Prior to Henry Ford adopting the production line in mass production, how were cars made? One car at a time by hand. And you'd have a group of workmen working on one part of the car here, and then they'd move to this one and start working on this part of the car here. And it was laborious, it was time consuming, and that meant that the cars were very, very expensive. What Henry Ford does is he mass produces cars using the assembly line, using all the mechanical means that were available to him. He is able to make cars quickly and cheaply. He famously says that he didn't want anybody working at his car factory who could not afford one of his cars. Of course, he could have paid people better, but that's a different story altogether. He does begin the process of mass producing automobiles. Now, what was really the outstanding automobile that first becomes this mass consumer product? The Model T, which we see over there on the right. The Model T was the first big selling car in the United States produced by Henry Ford. Some 17 million Model Ts rolled off the assembly line between like 1917 and 1924, or something like that. It was the first people's car. It was the first car that was accessible to middle-class workers. Now, people in the 1920s couldn't just go and buy a car. It was still an expensive commodity. So if you want something that you can't afford, but you still want to get it, how are you going to get it? You could borrow money, you could get a loan, you could buy it on credit. And what we begin to see in the 1920s is the development of a broader credit system in the United States. More people were buying consumer goods that they couldn't necessarily afford. This is the age when automobiles become tremendously popular. This one over here is a Model A, which is introduced in 1927. This is the age when mechanical washing machines first become readily available, refrigerators become readily available, appliances for the house. People wanted these things. They were going to start buying them on credit. They were going to use installment payments to acquire these goods. So people were purchasing lots and lots of commodities and putting off the payments or paying a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time. Now, what does this mean for the economy? Well, it's expanding tremendously. It is great for industry because people want things. Things are being produced. Things are going out. People are buying things and sticking things in their homes and buying automobiles and things like that. The economy is growing tremendously. But what is the economy largely based on? Borrowing and credit. Again, keep that in mind because that does come back to haunt us later on. Now, the proliferation of the automobile in the 1920s certainly has a profound impact on American society. One of the things that the automobile allowed was for people to have more freedom of movement. You could hop in your Model T, fill up the tank with gas, and in an hour you could be 30 miles out of town. How long would it take to do that prior to having an automobile? If you were walking, it could take several days. If you had a horse, it could take most of a day. If you were on the train, it wouldn't take that long, but you're kind of limited where the train goes, right? The train's not going to take a left on Main Street. The train's going to stay on the tracks, hopefully. So the automobile allowed new freedom of movement. And what did that lead to? Well, it led to changes in how people recreated. What are we going to do today? Well, why don't we go to the countryside and have a picnic like those folks over there? Something that we could do easily. It changed the patterns of crime in the United States. Because if you're a bank robber, you have your car, you're going to go to this town far away, you're going to rob the bank, hop in your car and head out of town. And by the time the police get there, you're going to be miles away. Much further away than you would be running away carrying sacks of money with you, right? So it changed patterns of crime. It changed patterns of really the ideas of independence, particularly of American youth. Young people had access to cars, and what did young people start doing in cars? Well, you can imagine what young people are doing in cars. That starts to become a thing in the 1920s. It gave birth to the idea of the road trip. I'm going to drive down the road. Maybe I'll pack a bag and go away for the weekend. It was easy to do. It was convenient to do because I had an automobile. It gives birth to the idea of the suburbs. Why would this give birth to the idea of the suburbs? Well, where were most of the jobs in urban America? In the city centers. And where did most people live? close to their jobs, because you had to get there and you had to get home. Well, all of a sudden you have this means of conveyance that can take you further away quickly. And maybe you don't want to live in the middle of town. Maybe you want to live someplace where there are trees. So the automobile had a profound impact on American society in the 1920s, an impact that, of course, continues to the present day. So we see the emergence of a consumer culture in the United States, a credit culture in the United States. What some have called conspicuous consumption becomes very popular in the United States. Well, you have something, so I'm going to have the same thing or something better, that sort of thing. That all really emerges in the 1920s and spreads over a broad segment of the American public. This decade was also a transformative decade in American culture, not just in material culture and in entertainment, but in high literary culture. What we see is that in the aftermath of the First World War, a new generation of American writers start to make their name and their reputation. A generation that is sometimes referred to as the Lost Generation. Now, why were they called the Lost Generation? Because they were coming of age in the aftermath of the First World War. And many of them had been impacted by the First World War, had been scarred by what they saw in Europe or here in the United States as a result of that conflict. Among the important writers of the Lost Generation are people like Ernest Hemingway. Anybody heard of him? Or F. Scott Fitzgerald and Eugene O'Neill, the playwright, and John Dos Passos, the novelist. These men were all products of that profound societal change of the First World War and the immediate aftermath. And those events make their way into their writing, into their commentary on contemporary American society. Many of these people actually grow so disenchanted with the United States in the 1920s that they leave. Where do they end up going? A lot of them? Paris. And Paris becomes a hotbed of American authors. Gertrude Stein is in Paris with these Lost Generation writers, and she in fact coins the name, the Lost Generation. So you have this new group of American writers, American artists who are reacting to the frivolity that they see in American society, who are scarred by what had happened during the First World War, and all of that is shaping their art, shaping their literature. Hemingway is probably the most famous man on here, although they're all pretty famous authors. Hemingway's experiences made in the First World War as an ambulance driver, shaped his first great novel, For Whom the Bell Tolls. A Farewell to Arms. It's not his first great novel, but one of his most popular novels. A Farewell to Arms, the story of an ambulance driver in Italy who falls in love with the nurse, and that story. F. Scott Fitzgerald was perhaps the most naturally talented of these writers, however. Have any of you read F. Scott Fitzgerald? Long time ago, The Great Gatsby, right? That's his best known story, his best known novel. And Fitzgerald certainly was a person who embraced the jazz age ethos. He and his wife Zelda were very much products of the Roaring 20s and of the frivolity of that age. And he, in his stories, does basically give us a nice snapshot of what was going on during that decade. The Great Gatsby, of course, is his most famous novel, his most celebrated novel, and certainly a novel that does show us a cultural snapshot of the United States in that decade. Here's an excerpt from The Great Gatsby, and a still from the most recent film version of the movie. It's describing a party at Gatsby's. It says, "There was dancing now on the canvas in the garden, old men pushing young girls backward in eternal graceless circles, superior couples holding each other tortuously, fashionably, and keeping in the corners, and a great number of single girls dancing individualistically, or relieving the orchestra for a moment of the burden of their banjo or the traps. By midnight, the hilarity had increased. A celebrated tenor had sung in Italian, and a notorious contralto had sung in jazz. And between the numbers, people were doing stunts all over the garden, while happy, vacuous bursts of laughter rose toward the summer sky. A pair of stage twins, who turned out to be the girls in yellow, we see them over there, did a baby act in costume, and champagne was served in glasses bigger than finger bowls. The moon had risen higher, and floating in the sound was a triangle of silver scales, trembling a little to the stiff, tinny drip of the banjos on the lawn." What are we seeing in that image but chaos, hilarity, frivolity, kind of trying to ignore the world around you. And that certainly was an important aspect of American culture in the 1920s, captured in this snapshot by Gatsby. Now, at the same time that this was going on, and this lost generation of writers were finding their voice and painting these depictions of American society, there was another movement happening in the United States that would profoundly impact American society, a movement that is called the Great Migration. The Great Migration was a diaspora, a fleeing of African Americans from the rural South, trying to escape the harsh economic conditions, the segregation, the Jim Crow laws in the South, moving to the cities in the North, heading up the East Coast to places like Philadelphia, New York, and New Haven, and Boston, heading up the Mississippi to places like Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland, heading up the Midwest to Minneapolis, and heading west to Oakland and Los Angeles. You had this mass movement of African American families across the United States from the rural South to these industrial cities in the North and in the West. Now, why did people undertake this voyage, like that family we see over there? Certainly, it was to escape racial oppression in the South, to get away from the threat of lynchings that occurred in the South. But it was also to find economic opportunity. Where were the jobs in industry? Where were the factories located? But in those industrial centers, in Detroit, in Cleveland, in Pittsburgh. So from about the 19-teens into the 1930s, this Great Migration saw hundreds of thousands of African Americans moving from one part of the country to another, looking for a better life, looking to have a more secure livelihood for themselves and for their family. Now, one of the offshoots, one of the developments of the Great Migration was a new philosophy of African American identity, a movement that comes to be called the New Negro Movement. As the 20th century dawns and as we get into the 1920s, there was a growing belief among African American leaders, scholars, intellectual leaders, activists, that the history, the story of African Americans had to be celebrated, that it was an identity to be embraced. In the late 19th century, many African American leaders said, we need to try to assimilate into white society, and that eventually we'll have equality, social equality, and legal equality. But that process was not occurring. So you see a new generation of African Americans saying we need to celebrate our own identity, celebrate the distinctiveness of African American identity. If we're accepted by white society, great. If not, we will still go on our own path with our own identity. Among the leaders in this was W.E.B. Du Bois, a scholar, an intellectual, a historian, and a sociologist, and Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey was a colorful individual, as you can see by his uniform there, who espoused the idea that African Americans should migrate back to Africa and settle in Africa, and that would kind of be a way of embracing that cultural heritage. Marcus Garvey later gets into some financial trouble. He was selling stock to his shipping line, the Black Star Line. It doesn't go well. But you do have this new idealism that emerges among African Americans. Now, this concept of the New Negro does contribute to the birth of an intellectual and artistic movement that comes to be called the Harlem Renaissance. What was the Harlem Renaissance but a new vision of African American society being expressed in literature, in music, and in art? It was centered in Harlem, in northern Manhattan, in New York City. But Harlem wasn't the only place where this Renaissance, this intellectual explosion was taking place. It was happening in cities across the United States. Chicago and Cleveland and Oakland and San Francisco all contributed to this intellectual movement. Harlem gets the fame because that was the largest concentration of these artists and writers. So you have, sculpture and literature and music all being produced by African American artists that would have a profound impact on broader American society. Yet the works that were produced depicted aspects of African American life and African American culture in the United States. Among the important figures in the Harlem Renaissance were people like Langston Hughes, perhaps the most celebrated individual in this group, who was a poet, a novelist, a playwright, a social critic. You have Zora Neale Hurston, a novelist and short story writer and anthropologist. There's James Weldon Johnson, who was really a remarkable figure in his own right. He was a novelist, a poet, a diplomat, an educator. He had a career as a Broadway songwriter in the early 20th century. He was the first African-American diplomat to represent the United States overseas, in Venezuela and in Nicaragua. So he plays an important role in that. You have Countee Cullen, a celebrated poet, and Augusta Savage, a famous sculptor. That previous sculpture we saw was created by her. So there is this intellectual revival, this artistic revival, this celebration of African-American culture that comes to be called the Harlem Renaissance, that is a product of the economic vitality of the United States at that time, the Great Migration and the emergence of this new Negro identity across the United States. All of that contributes to this Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance itself, of course, will influence later American writers and artists and really play a large role in shaping American culture in the mid-20th century. As the Harlem Renaissance is taking off and these writers are gaining fame, it is accompanied by another cultural movement, a cultural explosion, and that is jazz. Now, what is jazz? It's tough to explain, right? Jazz is a form of music that has its origins in New Orleans in the late 19th and early 20th century. But it is a form of music that combined different influences. It combined African-American rhythms and syncopations with European orchestration. And it celebrated the skill of the individual musicians. A lot of times, if you listen to jazz, it seems to be going all over the place. That's because you have a whole bunch of talented musicians who are doing their thing, all kind of working together, but demonstrating their own skill, their own virtuosity on their instruments. Jazz becomes a cultural phenomenon in the United States in the 1920s because it's carried on radio, because some of the great jazz musicians are creating music and performing their music during this time period. You have people like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong and Billie Holiday, Charlie Parker, and Cab Calloway, who all established their reputations during this time period, during the 1920s. The establishments where they performed become legendary, places like the Cotton Club and the Savoy Ballroom and the Apollo. All of those located in Harlem. But other places across the United States, clubs in Boston and Chicago and California, all become these epicenters where jazz was performed, where it was enjoyed by audiences. And one of the important things about jazz is that it does begin to break down racial barriers in the United States. Because who was listening to the music? It wasn't just the African Americans. It was whites. Young white Americans were going to the jazz clubs, were buying the jazz records, were tuning in on the radios. And what you have is kind of the beginnings of the breaking down of those racial barriers. Oftentimes you had mixed racial audiences in the jazz clubs listening to the musicians performing their music. When jazz starts to gain popularity, it terrified the older generation, right? Because here was this new musical form that they thought was wild and would lead people to juvenile delinquency and premarital sex and drugs and alcoholism and all that sort of stuff. Kind of the same thing parents were saying in the 1950s when Elvis was swiveling his hips on TV, right? And the same thing parents were saying in the 1980s when rap started to become popular. Oh, that music is dangerous. Well, if you tell your teenager that music is dangerous, what are they going to do? They're going to listen to it, and jazz becomes tremendously popular. It also becomes one of the first great American cultural exports, because jazz is carried to Europe by African-American troops during the First World War. It becomes hugely popular in London and in Paris and even in Berlin. And you see jazz clubs springing up across Europe in the 1920s. This form, distinctly American form of music, becomes an international commodity during the 1920s. So we have this cultural revival and this cultural explosion centered in Harlem, New York. The 1920s were also the age of the so-called New Woman. Now, who was the new woman? Well, think about the situation of women at the beginning of the decade. Did they have the right to vote? No. Now they have the right to vote. So there is a sense of political standing by the time we get to the 1920s. You also have all of those young women that had gone to work in the factories during the First World War. They had a taste of independence, a taste of financial independence and physical independence. When the war is over, do they want to go back to the farms and live with mom and dad? No. Do they want to get married and start having kids? Maybe not right away. There was a sense of freedom. And you begin to see more women going into the workplace, more women living on their own in the cities. And these women wanted to have a good time. So they start to go out. They start to use their income to have a good time, to maybe go out to a club and go dancing. They wear short skirts or short dresses like this that show off quite a bit of leg. Shocking and scandalous for the time. They wore makeup. They smoked cigarettes. All those sorts of things that were considered taboo to young women. This new generation were starting to undertake. It was the beginning of an expression of a new identity for women in the United States. Now, one of the things that also emerges during this time period that kind of fueled this concept of the new woman was the ready availability of birth control. Hugely controversial in different parts of the United States, kind of like today, but it was starting to become more readily available to women who wanted it. And that, of course, changed the way that women recreated. It gave them control over their fertility. It allowed them to decide when I want to become a mother or when I don't want to become a mother. And that continued or added to this concept of the new woman. Now, the other important change that we talked about at the beginning was the 18th Amendment and the beginning of prohibition in the United States. Prohibition, the 18th Amendment is ratified in January of 1919. Prohibition goes into effect in January of 1920. At that point, the United States becomes a dry country. It was now illegal to have, to produce, to consume, to sell alcoholic beverages. That's an important, alcoholic beverages. The federal government does define what an alcoholic beverage is. It's any beverage that has more than 0.5% of alcohol. Things were some things that were not considered alcoholic beverages were medicinal alcohols and sacramental alcohols. So sacramental wine was not part of prohibition, as were medicinal alcohols. That meant that pharmacists start to become one of the biggest suppliers of alcohol during Prohibition. If you got a doctor's prescription, you go to the pharmacist and you could get your bottle of rum and take it for medicinal purposes. There's a famous story that Winston Churchill, the great British statesman, who was no stranger to drink, came to the United States during Prohibition, and he brought with him a doctor's note saying that it was medicinally required for him to have access to alcohol, so that he could avoid prohibition laws. But when prohibition begins in 1920, it became the job of federal agents, local police, local authorities to get rid of the alcohol that was there. And we end up with scenes like this across the United States. Bottles of whiskey being smashed by that happy prohibition officer there. Barrels of beer being dumped into the sewers. Scenes of great tragedy across the United States as prohibition starts to happen. But prohibition caused a problem. And what was the big problem with prohibition? Is that most Americans didn't support it. Most Americans still wanted to have a drink after a hard day's work or have a drink on the weekend. So as prohibition goes into effect, most Americans start to become willing lawbreakers. I can't go to the corner store and get a bottle of beer, but I know a guy who knows a guy who can get me some illegal beer. And what we begin to see in the 1920s is the rise of the bootleggers and the speakeasies. Now, what was a bootlegger? It's these guys. People who distributed illegal alcohol. Sometimes it was made domestically in illegal stills. Oftentimes it was imported from other countries, dropped offshore and picked up by fast-moving boats, brought into secret coves on the coast of the United States and distributed through a sophisticated network to avoid detection by the authorities. This truck over here is a bootlegger's truck. What does it look like but a lumber truck? But what's inside it? An empty cavity where bottles of whiskey could be stored to be distributed to the various speakeasies, which were the illegal underground drinking establishments that spring up everywhere, all across the United States, in every city and every town. except maybe in Utah, there were these drinking establishments that spring up. I'm sure if we dig deep enough in the history of Norfolk, we could find one or two speakeasies that were in town. Perhaps even people you know were running these speakeasies. In any case, what happens is that most Americans start to become willing lawbreakers, start to kind of ignore the rules that were on the book because they wanted to get a drink. They wanted to have alcohol. Now, the popularity of alcohol in the United States during the 1920s seems to increase, which is kind of counterintuitive to the fact that alcohol is illegal. And pretty much it was an open secret. Everybody knew what was going on. These two cartoons from the time period kind of highlight that. This one on the left says there's two kinds of men in this town, bootleggers and customers. You were either selling it or you were consuming it. And the other side, east side, west side, all around the block, the bootleggers Russian business at all hours of the clock. Though enforcement of prohibition laws fell to federal and local authorities, by the time we get a few years into prohibition, the local authorities started to be a little bit more lax in enforcing it. So you see that police officer there, he's kind of looking the other way while that sale of illegal alcohol was going on. Prohibition basically fails, and it fails dramatically, and it fails miserably in the United States. It was a movement that had a good idea behind it. How do we remove the sins of society? But it was a movement that was never going to succeed because, frankly, we like to drink in the United States. It was destined to fail from the beginning. One thing that prohibition does do is it gives a tremendous boost to the rise of organized crime in the United States. Organized crime had existed before prohibition, but what prohibition did is it incentivized organized crime. It made the control of the alcohol distribution networks tremendously profitable. And people like this guy over here, who's that? Al Capone. Emerge as immensely wealthy, immensely powerful and influential figures during Prohibition. At the height of Prohibition, at the height of his powers, Al Capone essentially controlled Chicago. He had police officers, he had judges, he had politicians on his payroll. And he eliminated his rivals, in bloody manner. That's the infamous St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1927. Capone was untouchable in Chicago. What eventually brings Capone down? Income tax evasion. If he had paid his taxes, he would have been okay. But he ends up in prison in Alcatraz for a few years, and then he retires to his estate in Florida. Anybody know how Al Capone dies? Syphilis. His brain essentially turned to mush, and he died. Probably because of the excesses of his time and control of Chicago. But he does become this iconic figure in American history because he was a great gangster, warlord, criminal that gains stature and power during Prohibition itself. So this is the situation we have in the United States as we head deeper into the 1920s. You have frivolity, you have consumer culture, people are buying things left and right, people are buying things they shouldn't be buying legally, like alcohol. Organized crime is on the rise. The president, Calvin Coolidge, is trying to do nothing. So again, his popularity remains at an all-time high. In 1928, we have another presidential election. Coolidge decides not to seek re-election. So he is stepping away from the presidency. The Republicans in 1928 nominate a guy named Herbert Hoover. The Democrats nominate Alfred E. Smith as their candidate for president in 1928. So this is the situation in the election of 1928. When the American people go to the polls in 1928, Herbert Hoover wins in a substantial landslide. As we see here in blue, Herbert Hoover, he wins nearly 84% of the electoral vote. The only part of the country that Smith wins is the Deep South and Massachusetts. Now, anybody know anything about Alfred E. Smith? He was a Catholic. What was it that doomed his presidency in all of that blue area over there? His Catholicism. The South votes for him because he was the Democrat. He also wins Massachusetts. Why? Lots of Catholics in Massachusetts. But everywhere else, that was kind of the strike against Smith. His policies didn't matter. It was his Catholicism that was the main issue in his candidacy. And Herbert Hoover is elected president of the United States. Now, what do you know about Herbert Hoover?
Wasn't he the Commerce Secretary?
He was the Commerce Secretary. In fact, he had a long career in public service. Now, Herbert Hoover could have been one of the great American success stories. He was born relatively poor on a farm in Iowa, but through his own skill, his own determination, his own ability, he becomes a tremendously successful businessman and one of the wealthiest men in the country. During the First World War, he's involved with the Food Administration, which dealt with the distribution of food to the American public, to the Army, to our allies. So he was in charge of the logistics of that. He becomes the Commerce Secretary under Harding and under Coolidge. So he was a distinguished public servant, very, very good at what he did. Again, a self-made man, kind of a rags to riches American success story. Great guy to be elected president, right? Sure, except that Hoover believed in extremely limited government. He believed that government should not be playing a role in the daily lives of Americans or in the functioning of the American economy, which, in the 1920s seems like a good idea. Boom times, everything is going great. So we don't need to meddle in it. The problem that Hoover runs into is that in his first year as president, in the summer going into the fall of 1929, that booming American economy starts to show some cracks in the foundation. What we begin to see is that several banks in the Midwest begin to collapse. People who had put money in those banks lose their money. The banks had overextended their credit, had overextended their loans, and now couldn't collect when they needed to. So the banks are failing. Failure of banks leads to the failure of farms, leads to the failure of railroads, leads to the failure of real estate. And all of that begins to snowball. And eventually what happens? You end up in what comes to be called the Great Depression. Now, most historians, most people mark the start of the Great Depression with the stock market crash in October of 1929. That is kind of the symbolic moment when the Depression starts. But it wasn't the stock market crash that caused the Depression. The stock market crash was a result of the other economic issues that had been building up over 1929, even some in 1928, that led to the failure of banks and the collapse of real estate prices and all that sort of stuff. The stock market crash, which we see here on the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, Wall Street in a panic as stocks crash, and the crowds gathered outside the American Stock Exchange in New York, was a big deal because almost overnight, investors lost half of their money in the initial stock market crash. The prices, the value of stock collapsed precipitously, and that caused economic ripples across the country. As banks were collapsing, as stock prices were falling, people begin to lose their jobs. When people begin to lose their jobs, they're not buying products. When they're not buying products, what does that mean for the people in the factories making those products? Well, they don't need them, so they start losing their jobs, and you have this widening cycle of tremendous economic downturn that will not only be an American problem, but a global problem. The entire global economy collapses in 1929. We can look at the Dow Jones Industrial from 1928 to 1938, a decade snapshot, to see how dramatic this collapse was. In 1928, the stock market was hitting unprecedented heights. Dow Jones Industrial was at 384. What is it today, incidentally? 39,000. So it's a lot higher than this. But this was the high at that time. Almost overnight, it loses half its value. There is a slight recovery, but then that collapses until we get down here to 1932, the deepest part of the Depression, when the stock market had lost 90% of its value. It was a huge, precipitous, catastrophic economic collapse. At the height of the Depression, unemployment in the United States hovered around 25%. 1 in 4 people were without jobs. Now, the most recent economic downturn we had, the Great Recession of 2009, unemployment reached about 9%. So think about that. 24%, 25% versus 9%. kind of put into perspective how chaotic, how depressing the Great Depression was, how dramatic the Great Depression was. And in fact, the Great Depression did impact Americans across the economic spectrum across the country. People lost their homes, people lost their livelihoods. The economy slowed down. Even the wealthy were not necessarily insulated by this, because if you had a lot of money invested in the stock market, suddenly your stock isn't worth anything. You don't have that money anymore. So it was an event that had a profound impact across American society, across the United States, around the world. These are some iconic images of the Great Depression. You have the migrant mother and her children. One of the things that happens during this time period is people start to move across the country, moving from the South to California, looking for work, moving from the Great Plains during the Dust Bowl years to other parts of the country, looking for land to farm or fields to work or some way of surviving. You have people hopping on trains and boxcars and riding from place to place looking for some source of economic stability. In a lot of cities and towns, soup lines and bread lines begin to spring up. This is an iconic, kind of ironic picture where you see people lined up looking for help, looking for relief in front of a giant billboard that says the American way, world's highest standard of living. So you had scenes like this across the country. It was chaotic, it was destructive, it was upending. What is Hoover doing as President of the United States? Very, very little. Hoover's fundamental political belief was that the government should not be involved, that the economy would straighten itself out. He does believe in what was called associationalism, which was that the government would help bring different entities together to kind of solve the problem, business and labor together, different aspects of the economy together to talk about what the problem was, but the government did not have a direct role in it. It isn't until 1930 or so, 1930, 1931, that Hoover does start to sign some legislation, but the legislation doesn't have any effect. Some of it actually backfires and causes the Depression to grow deeper. And as Americans are losing their jobs and losing their livelihoods and losing their homes, you see a lot of refugee cities springing up. These come to be called Hoovervilles, the shanty towns that are built on the outskirts of many American cities where people who had lost their jobs and their homes live in tar paper shacks, trying to survive, trying to find a way to make a living. It is the Great Depression, the stock market crash, and the presidency of Herbert Hoover that really brings an end to the Roaring 20s. That prosperity, that seeming unending prosperity and good times comes to a crashing end. The 1930s, the Great Depression, were a tremendously trying time in American society. Hoover, of course, is voted out of office in 1932. Franklin Roosevelt comes into office, and Roosevelt had an entirely different philosophy of government than Hoover did. And really, the iconic image of the Jazz Age is from that period of prosperity in the middle of the 1920s. When that economic prosperity collapsed, a lot of the cultural growth in the United States collapsed with it. The Harlem Renaissance comes to an end early in the Great Depression because many of those artists, many of those writers no longer had sponsors to fund their work. A lot of the magazines and the publications that had printed the work of the lost generation, those fold during the Great Depression. So it has a profound impact politically, economically, and culturally on the United States. This period of the Roaring 20s was a brief, glorious, celebratory period in many ways, but it was just that, a brief period in the story of 20th century America. And that is the Roaring 20s. Does anybody have any questions? Thank you. Yes?
Would you say that it was in the 1920s or before when the United States was being viewed as number one in terms of its economy in the world?
That happens at around the turn of the 20th century. Around 1900, 1901, the United States emerges with the largest economy, surpassing Britain and Germany in terms of industrial production, in terms of economic wealth. It's right at the turn of the 20th century. Certainly by 1919, the end of the First World War, the United States was viewed as one of the great powers, something we had gained a little bit earlier, but we had a tradition of kind of being inward looking rather than outward looking. So in the aftermath of the First World War, the size of the American military is greatly reduced. We kind of step off of the world stage for several decades. And so we were still the leading industrial producer, the leading economic force in the world, but we weren't really directly involved in, or didn't necessarily want to be involved in global politics.
What was the role of the Federal Reserve in the Depression?
It did very little. The Federal Reserve is established 1913, I think it is, under Woodrow Wilson. And it was meant to be a mechanism to prevent economic collapses. It was meant to kind of be a clearinghouse for currency. It was meant to stabilize the liquidity of banks. It doesn't really succeed during the Great Depression. There are studies that have been done about the direct role that the Federal Reserve had in the Great Depression, but because Hoover was unwilling to kind of involve the federal government directly in it, I think that kind of hamstrung what the Federal Reserve could do. What we begin to see under FDR is that FDR is trying anything to stop the economic slide, to help the economy rebound. The entire New Deal program is involved in that. I'd have to look into what the role the Federal Reserve had in the New Deal to see how active it was in that.
The income tax and the passage of the income tax, didn't that have an impact?
1916, and the 16th Amendment is ratified, that allowed the federal government to start collecting an income tax.
Rather than getting the taxes from the whiskey.
From the whiskey, well, they were about to get rid of the whiskey. It wasn't going to. Yeah.
So that they could compensate for all the tax money
Yeah.
on the booze, right?
Until the passage of the income tax, the ratification of the 16th Amendment, most federal income came from excise taxes, so things like whiskey and other excises, commodities like that, and from trade, from the duties and the import duties for goods coming into the country. That was basically what bankrolled the federal government. The income tax kind of eliminated a lot of that. That reminds me, I need to do my taxes. But that certainly was kind of a new economic development in the United States. But it's something that had been pushed for decades by populists and by progressives in the late 19th century.
Did I read that Walgreen got their start by providing medicinal?
I don't know, but if they were around then, they certainly would have benefited from it. Because again, it was the pharmacists and priests who had access to alcohol, legal alcohol during that time. So if you had a prescription, again, from your doctor, I need 2 shots of whiskey every night to fall asleep for my health, get that filled at the pharmacy. Yes?
About prohibition, you're saying if prohibition was not supported by the majority of the American population, how did 2/3 of the states pass an amendment?
Because it's the state legislatures that do it. So it is, the ratification of amendments is a complex process. You do have to have 2/3 of the states that ratify it. And it's the state legislatures or specially appointed commissions that will ratify the amendments. If you elect somebody to office, once they're in office, they can do essentially whatever they want until the next election. Until the next election, right? So our politicians are only really responsible to us or responsive to us every so often. And because there had been a national prohibition during the war, it kind of steamrolled into the after-war period and led to the ratification of the 18th Amendment. Some states were fully on board, some places were not necessarily so, but ultimately more than 36 states do ratify the amendment, and it does become the law of the land. Go ahead.
Was it the law with prohibition? Could you make homemade brew and drink it yourself?
No, the manufacturing of intoxicating beverages was banned.
Okay.
Now, the 18th Amendment kind of was the constitutional part. The implementation arm of it was called the Volstead Act. And the Volstead Act defined what intoxicating beverages were, that 1/2 of 1% alcohol, and it created the enforcement mechanism for prohibition itself. So the Volstead Act was the law that puts prohibition into action.
Wasn't that one of the few amendments was ever?
It's the only amendment to be overturned. The 21st Amendment does get rid of the 18th Amendment.
Can you say something about the Scholars Association that you're a part of, and your presentation? Thank you very much. I have the impression you're a PhD and expert.
I do a lot of public speaking like this, so I give a lot of talks on a variety of topics. I teach history at Bridgewater State. My background is actually in archaeology, and I kind of ended up doing this by working for the National Park Service, Department of the Interior. We send people to jail, and that's kind of how I got into public speaking was through that. You don't do a lot of public speaking as an archaeologist. You do a lot of drinking as an archaeologist, so that's going back to Prohibition. But yeah, so it was through the Park Service that I ended up having this skill, such as it is.
We toured the Jack Daniels distillery in Tennessee years ago, and they took us to a vat bigger than these tables, and the guy lifted the top because it was chained to let it waft a bit. And he said, "What does that smell like?" And some 6-year-old says, "That smells like Grandma."
I can understand that. All right, any other questions, comments? Any other grandmas? Well, thanks for joining me. I hope you found this enlightening and entertaining. And I will see you next time. I don't remember when I'm coming back here, but I do have something else scheduled for later on in the spring. Hopefully it will actually feel like spring at that point. So thanks a lot.